to our Gender and Climate Change series. Today, we explore the unique vulnerabilities that climate change poses in populations across Kenya, Uganda, and Botswana. In 2023, these countries collaborated with the United Nations Development Programme and the Africa Group of Negotiators Expert Support, supported by the Gates Foundation, on a groundbreaking gender and climate change vulnerability hotspot mapping study. This research highlighted high-risk sectors in areas like water, agriculture, and nature-based tourism. Through this series, we'll engage top government officials and experts on climate resilience and the importance of gender-responsive actions and policies. Join us as we explore strategies to protect the most vulnerable. We are joined by the Principal Secretary, State Department for Gender and Affirmative Action, Ms. Anne Wangombe.
My name is Anne Wangombe. I'm the Principal Secretary, State Department for Gender and Affirmative Action, Kenya. Africa is warming up faster than other parts of the world. And it is estimated that by 2030, close to 100 million people will face the impact of climate change, that is drought, and rising sea levels along the coastal regions, which will potentially displace millions of people. Our country, Kenya, is not spared either, considering that a large part of our country is semi-arid and arid. However, Kenya has been at the forefront in coming up with strategies to mitigate against climate change as well as adaptation mechanisms. Kenya is among the first African countries to develop legislation and policies that promote the participation of women in climate action in line with the Constitution of Kenya 2010. The Kenyan National Adaptation Plan and nationally determined contributions also identify gender as a cross-cutting policy priority and commit to mainstreaming gender in sectoral climate change adaptation and mitigation actions. Despite the obvious gender-differentiated impacts of climate change and policy initiation, the integration of gender equality into climate action has been gradual, with feasible impacts yet to be felt. Considering that climate change accelerates existing social and gender inequalities, there is a need for a new transformative approach to increase men, boys, women, and girls' capabilities and opportunities to boost their productivity and participation with increased adaptive capacity to climate change in Kenya. Increasing climate risks pose serious threats to achieving Kenya's sustainable development goals and returns on investment in various climate-sensitive sectors such as agriculture, water, and energy. Kenya's updated nationally determined contribution notes that progressive climate change impacts estimated losses are 3 to 4% of the GDP annually and hinders the country's overall development efforts. Climate change in Kenya is related to increased temperatures, changes in rainfall patterns, and prolonged dry seasons. In recent decades, the country has observed high frequency and severity of droughts, floods, heat, cold waves, and incidences of pests and diseases. Among the key sectors impacted by increasing climate risks in Kenya are agriculture, water, and energy due to their heavy reliance on the natural environment. These are also sectoring that directly impact on women's and girls' critical roles of nurturing families, like cooking, finding firewood, food, water for cooking, and other related domestic roles. Having said that, therefore, gender is a critical factor in understanding vulnerability to climate change. The focus of the gender and climate vulnerability assessment was to provide information, views, and experiences necessary for strengthening gender considerations in adaptation and mitigation planning and implementation in Kenya. The findings will therefore be very useful for the national as well as county governments for planning and budgeting, as well as implementation of gender-responsive climate action in the targeted sectors and beyond.
For this particular conversation, we are joined by Ms. Jacqueline Makoha, Director Gender at the State Department for Gender and Affirmative Action.
Let me begin by saying that climate change impacts all sectors. The magnitude only varies based on how that sector interacts directly with the environment, which essentially is the most impacted by impacts of climate change. If I may begin, and this also runs across all the sectors, the impacts are largely affected by our roles, our gender roles as women and men in community. There are roles that are undertaken at domestic level, while others in the formal sector. So when you look at agriculture, you find that there are differences in terms of what women do within the agricultural sector as compared to men. So men will mostly be found in the commercial sector of agriculture, while for women you'll find that they are mostly busy in the domestic sector. Why is this so? Because women naturally are nurturers of the family, so their engagement in agriculture is mostly for domestic use, to nurture their families. So when agriculture is impacted by climate change, men will lose in terms of the commercial sense of it, that they lose investment as regards the economic gain that they get from agriculture, which essentially would really also impact the family, because in most of our communities men are breadwinners. But for women who are then nurturers of the family, the impact affects the food security of the family. It means that probably their households would go hungry without food or water or other necessities. When you look at energy sector, again, the differences are largely affected by the same gender roles. So you find that in Kenya, most of our energy is dependent on like hydro, wind, etc. So when the sector is impacted by climate change, there's a constraint on the energy supplies, and you find that majority of women, for instance, are found in the rural areas. They are supposed to look for firewood for cooking. If energy is expensive, it means that they can't afford energy for lighting and etc. While men, because of their engagement in the formal energy sector, you'll find that they are impacted because of the high cost of energy that is used for industrial activities and all that. For water, again, the same gender roles. Water for commercial purposes largely dominated by men, while water for domestic use by women. So you'll find that women and girls are the ones who spend more time walking long distances looking for water at the expense of either education, if it's for girls, while for women in their domestic spaces, it will mean that there's more burden. The burden of work goes up because they spend the otherwise productive time to go looking for water. Where there is scarcity of water, you'll find that, for instance, in pastoral communities, there will even be conflict, including gender-based violence, because men would ideally be looking for water for purposes of their cattle, while women will be competing for the same water for domestic use, for cooking, for cleaning, for washing, and so on. So the impacts, therefore, and across all these sectors, with reduction of these resources, you'll find that they are actually a major contributing factor to incidences of gender-based violence or conflict between communities, but also at domestic level.
Moving on to the national launch on sex disaggregated data. Why is it critical to use sex disaggregated data when assessing climate change vulnerability?
It's important to disaggregate data on the basis of sex, because as we started, we said climate change does not affect men and women the same. So it's important for us to know what kinds of impacts affect men, what kinds of impacts affect women. But for us, disaggregation is beyond just the sex, male, female, because we appreciate that men are not homogeneous, neither are women. So if, for instance, we are disaggregating the men, we would look at men in their different categories: young men, older men, youth who are men, boys, men with disabilities, and the same to women. It's important because in the wake of climate-related disasters, you'll find that, for instance, much as we say that women are more vulnerable to climate change impacts, you'll find that women with disabilities, for example, whether young or old, they face even worse. They are more vulnerable, because even for them to just move from point A to B is a problem. So if it's a problem for an able-bodied woman, it's a worse problem for a woman with disabilities. So that disaggregation is very important. I know we are still grappling with just the general sex disaggregation, but you can imagine that we must really go down to disaggregate even further, so that then our interventions are informed by the real needs. For instance, I remember one person with disabilities giving an example in one of Kenya's flood-prone areas, that during the rescue efforts, when they were to be moved to higher grounds, people with disabilities were actually rescued last. Why? Because many of them, like those on crutches or who have wheelchairs, for instance, the wheelchair is seen to be occupying a lot of space on the boat. And here you have many people waiting for that rescue. So the rescuers would then decide to rescue as many people, because then, I'm just thinking that it could be a natural thought that if I'm to lose, let me lose less. But that less is a person with disability, because they have a wheelchair. So they lump many people into the boat and take them to higher ground, and then come with these ones who have, for lack of a better word, baggage. So that baggage is the wheelchair. So you can imagine that vulnerability. It means that if the waters were coming up, that person will actually lose their lives. So that is to say that in matters climate change, in climate disasters, persons with disability are very, very vulnerable. So if we don't disaggregate to know that in this community we have X number of people with disabilities, it means that in our rescue effort we'll not have considered that, because in an ideal situation maybe there should be a dedicated rescue effort for persons with disability, maybe for women with children and all that. So that's why it's very important.
So now, how does this data inform better climate change policies, specifically regarding the roles of men and women?
Once you have data, you know the need, the magnitude, the resources required to address that intervention, and therefore, you know, the importance of data can't be overstated. It's very important because it will inform across board, right from the planning, budgeting to implementation.
How did the participatory approach of the study, involving gender specialists, meteorologists, and data analysts, enhance the accuracy and the effectiveness of the vulnerability mapping?
It was important right from the onset of the study to have these different professions or categories of institutions that we felt are relevant to the study. Remember that in the initial stages, the study heavily relied on existing official data. So for us, our official data institution of government is the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. That is the government's, credible data. So it was very important that we have an insider who could look at the various variables and the need for data across sectors. They were then our link into those data sets that were required for the study. Of course, there are some already published official studies by the government. However, the variables that we were looking at within the study, you find that data had not been analyzed to address those specific variables. So our colleagues from the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics really came in handy to go back to the raw data and just process for us the information relevant to the study. When it comes to weather, again the same. There is data that is out there in terms of weather predictions and all that, but our colleagues within those institutions were really helpful in breaking down some of this information to feed into the study, and so to the other, like the GIS experts and all that. So the technical capacities across board, including gender experts and all that, was really complementary in just ensuring that no stone is untouched within the study for purposes of credibility of it, and also ownership, because we find that some of the conclusions and recommendations really have to be owned by the owners of data. For instance, we wouldn't want a study that is challenged by the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. So that is why, and we feel that that really enhanced the credibility of the study. When our teams would go to a county, they would select stakeholders from the official county officials, but also stakeholders, some of whom are represented through civil society organizations. So it was a whole mixed group of people who participated in the ground truthing. Also, like farmers, because we are looking at the agriculture sector. So our team was also able to talk to some of the women and men who actually practice farming and could speak to how, the impacts of climate change have, affected their agricultural activities. So I think it was very important for the study to also talk to the wearer of the shoe, so that we don't just rely on secondary data, but we really listen to the voices of the people who feel the impact.
We are grateful to have Mr. Baldwin from the State Department of Gender, and we are going to be talking about the data collection and analysis. Now, kindly elaborate on how the data collection was done.
First of all, this study was based on a vulnerability assessment framework that was adopted by IPCC in their third and fourth report that tried to show the interaction between exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity to generate vulnerabilities in different regions, communities, and among different people. So the exposure, we looked at different determinants of exposure that include the issues of rainfall, the issues of number of dry days, and also the issues of precipitations. While for sensitivity, we focused on three sectors, that is the agriculture sector, the energy sector, and the water sector. And thirdly, on adaptive capacity, we are looking at the adaptive capacity of different people within different regions. So after that, we embarked on the collection of data, and we collected secondary data that was collected within the official statistics of government. And this was collected through the technical working committee that was comprised of various entities. And before data collection itself, we went through the process of identification of various variables. Variables under exposure, variables under sensitivity, and also variables under adaptive capacities.
How did you ensure that the data collection and the analysis for the gender and climate vulnerability were representative at the county levels?
Thank you. All the variables we collected, we made sure that they were disaggregated at county level. And then once we started the process of data collection itself, we normalized the data at that level. We also weighted the data to make sure that we develop a standard sub-index for each county. After developing sub-indexes for each county, we were able now to generate hotspot maps that show the nexus between gender and climate change in various sectors, in agriculture, water, and also the energy sector.
And so what were some of the key indicators used to create the vulnerability sub-indexes, and why were those particular sectors chosen?
The sectors were identified to have the greatest vulnerabilities to be studied, especially in the nexus between gender and climate change. And under exposure, we looked at so many variables, and this includes the issues of rainfall, the issues of temperature changes, and also the issues of precipitation and the number of wet days and dry days. For sensitivity, of course, in each sector we looked at different variables. So in agriculture sector, for example, we looked at even the dependence of population on the agriculture sector. We looked at the contribution of agriculture sector to GDP. We also looked at the issues of land ownership among different populations as some of the variables within the agriculture sector. For energy sector, some of the indicators we looked at was the use of clean fuels like access to electricity, and also even the use of firewood in terms of as a source of energy. For water, we also looked at the issues of water demand and the water supply, so that we can actually pick out the elements of how is it easy for a given region to access to clean and affordable water. So there are many variables that we looked at, and we analyzed them to see the contribution that they contributed to vulnerability.
So what role did ground truthing play in validating the data collected and ensuring accuracy?
Thank you for that question. One important thing is the generation of hotspot maps that actually indicated what are the hotspot areas and the cold spot areas as far as gender and climate change in those sectors are concerned. And for us to validate that data, we did ground truthing in at least 3 subnational levels, just to validate the data that we had run through the generation of hotspot maps. And actually we found out the things we picked on the ground were consistent with the results that we had obtained through the generation of hotspot map. So ground truthing is very important because we get the experiences on the ground. We also get the views of those players that are acting within those regions to confirm the validity of our results.
Preliminary findings at the COP28. How have these findings been received at major platforms like the Africa Climate Summit and the COP28? And what steps have been taken to translate the findings into action?
This study, I think we have done it, as a whole kind of technical working group, kind of grouping, where each member of different sector will come together to keep on validating this information step by step. But we made a major milestone by presenting the same results, first of all at the African Climate Summit, where different players from around the world came in and gave their contribution, which we integrated into the report. The second sharing of the report was done at the COP28, and we subjected to members in one of our side events, and they gave us a comment, and they have really informed the shaping of the findings of this study.
As we conclude, we are joined by Mr. Michael from the Ministry of Environment, Department of Climate Change.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Michael Ochieng Okumu. I'm a Deputy Director in charge of climate change negotiations and finance of the Republic of Kenya under the Ministry of Environment, Climate Change and Forestry. And at the Climate Change Directorate, we do many things, including formulation of climate policy, formulation of climate programs, and of course, this is done in collaboration with various players, since climate change actually affects each and every member of our society. So we ensure that we engage everybody in society. We call it whole of society approach. So we have to ensure we engage government players, non-state players from civil society, private sector, and from various parts of the society. Now, at the Climate Change Directorate, I'm also the National Gender and Climate Change Focal Point for the Republic of Kenya under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, together with my colleague from the State Department of Gender, who is also a National Gender and Climate Change Focal Point. So in a nutshell, we ensure that we have focal points from the Ministry in charge of climate change and the Ministry in charge of gender, so that we have not a silo approach, but a coordinated approach from both gender and climate change, since both climate change and gender are cross-cutting aspects or themes across the various sectors. So it becomes easier to do it like that. So under the Gender and Climate Change Hotspot mapping project, we came up with ideas that there is need for us to clearly target the various vulnerable segments of our society, and in so doing, it was therefore necessary that we select 3 sectors to help kind of single out the various vulnerabilities across the sectors. So basically we worked on the sectors of agriculture, of water and energy, so that we are able to identify various vulnerabilities within those particular sectors. And in so doing, it is easier to come up with clear interventions that are able to address such kind of vulnerabilities. And this is critical because we realize that as the climate change impacts continue to increase both in intensity and in its frequency, it is obvious that we are going to have it impacting our societies more and more, and therefore it is needful that we clearly identify how the most vulnerable segments of our society can be targeted for intervention that would be able to reduce their vulnerabilities. So we started this some time back, and under, of course, Agnes, and we worked taking cue from the pilot that was done in Rwanda, and they had some very good outcomes of that. We thought this was something that was very good for Kenya in helping us to come up with certain tools that will help us, especially in the policy formulation process, to have effective policies. So if I may just say that gender and climate change hotspot mapping is a tool that can be used not only by government but also other non-state actors who come or who feel or who have a project that they need to come up with, that they want to easily create tangible and visible impact on the ground. This tool would help such kind of development partners or project proponents to be able to clearly know where to take a specific type of project to identify clearly, address certain vulnerabilities, and also what segment of the society would be more vulnerable. And by the way, from the Kenyan approach, when we talk of gender, we do not basically zero into women, as sometimes it happens in many countries. In Kenya, we look at all segments of the society, especially with respect to their vulnerabilities, for specific targeted interventions, including people with disabilities, including those we call people from marginalized communities, marginalized due to development and so many other aspects that have led to their marginalization. So we address these under the gender banner, and we are able to clearly target them. Capacity building for gender responsive policies is one crucial area that this hotspot mapping would really help in. And this is because, first and foremost, whether at the national or at the subnational, there are people who develop their sector-specific or county-specific, or by county here I mean subnational kind of specific policies, and it is important they understand that these policies on programs or projects should be able to target or to address the various gender inequalities and gender vulnerabilities on the ground. And we could be having, for instance, experts in, say, water, and when they come up with their water kind of policies with a gender-blind kind of approach, they would come up with policies that would, yes, attempt to address the water kind of challenges, but may end up creating some kind of maladaptation, in the sense that it may end up being a policy that instead of it empowering the entire community, it kind of leads to more imbalance in the community. For instance, if you have a water project that was targeting, for instance, to avail the time that, say, the ladies from that community spent going various long distances for water, and then at the end of the day you end up, yes, reducing the distance that is needed to go for the water, but it becomes unavailable to them due to other bureaucracies or other new bottlenecks that are put in place in the process. You end up not addressing the real issues. You end up now making the women in that society more vulnerable, because they may need to go to do, not to walk long, but to end up in a certain situation where they are water is available, but they are unable to access it, and they have no excuse. They have no reason to tell maybe the society why they still need to go long distance for the same water that is easily available. And those are some of the things that need to be addressed. Now, when we talk on various issues, like, for instance, even mitigation, climate change mitigation, going for long distances to look for firewood for household use or such kind of a thing could easily be addressed by certain very simple kind of interventions. And these interventions, when they are well articulated to the society, it would reduce the need for, say, women in a society to endanger their lives going long distances through thick forest, interacting with wildlife and so on, in order to find fuel for household use. So as such, when we build the capacity of the various policy players, both at the national and the subnational level, it helps in really articulating and addressing that type of vulnerability at the ground. Now, if I may give a few examples, is that we currently have a project that we have targeted for the grassroots that is doing so well, that is called the FLOCA program, Financing Locally Led Climate Action. This is a program that was formulated by the Ministry of Environment, Climate Change and Forestry, together with the National Treasury, in order to address the vulnerabilities of communities at the grassroots level, to enable them identify the climate change risks, prioritize them, and also suggest a solution, of course, with the help of experts, and implement those solutions, as well as monitor and report the various solutions at the grassroots level. And in this particular project, we have something we call the participatory climate risk assessment. And in the participatory climate risk assessment, we also kind of integrate some element of hotspot mapping approach to be able to identify which part of the county or of the ward needs what type of intervention, and that such kind of intervention can therefore ends up being gender responsive, and it really or actually sorts out the solution on the ground. So there are so many ways we are coming up with building the capacity of our various players, state players and non-state players, to ensure that we have clear gender responsive policies, programs and activities on the ground to address climate change, both mitigation and adaptation.
What key lessons did participants from Kenya, Uganda and Botswana learn during the introductory workshop on the gender climate change hotspot mapping?
I think the lessons were varied. One, that for let's say the gender experts that were in the workshop, it was important that they appreciate the science side of like the GIS and the hotspot mapping concept per se, but also it was interesting for the teams to share across like how climate change impacts the different sectors. So you would find that in terms of even prioritizing the sectors of study, you'd find that there were a bit of variations between Uganda, Kenya and Botswana on how they experience climate change. So the cross-learning across the teams, just being able to share, but also appreciating that being in the African region, there are quite some commonalities, especially on aspects of the gender roles, you know, for men and women in the three countries, where, you know, there was quite some similarities, and therefore I'm sure even in terms of conclusions as regards the vulnerabilities in the sectors, there's bound to be some similarities. But then in terms of the impacts of climate change, you'll find that like for example parts of Uganda, you know, for them they are grappling more with flooding, while you find that a large part of Kenya is more of the drought. So just also appreciating this impact, that for some people they'll be struggling with a lot of water, while some others are struggling with scarcity of the same. So those were some of the interesting lessons from that workshop.
My sincere gratitude to the Agnes for supporting this study on granular gender and climate change vulnerability hotspot mapping. We are confident that this study is going to help us in determining what is going to be our next course of action as a government, particularly helping us in knowing how to deal with the challenges that we have described earlier. Thank you.
As we wrap up, I'd like to sincerely appreciate Agnes Africa for leading this transformative gender and climate change vulnerability hotspot mapping study, and other key contributors like the CGIAR ICRA, the UNDP Botswana, the Gates Foundation, the Gender Impact Platform, government officials and key technical experts, and the community. Your dedication is paving way for gender-responsive interventions and policies. To our audience, thank you so much for listening. If you'd like more information or to get involved, kindly visit the Agnes Africa website at agnesafrica.org. I've been your host, Angel Chalo.